Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming this morning. I'm going to be discussing this morning what our choices are in terms of brain health. This is what our options are. It's always a great slide to project around the lunch hour. And, somebody asked me during the tasting, well, what is it about neurology? What got you started in neurology? And I thought back when I was a third-year medical student at the University of Miami, and when I did my neurology rotation, I was in the first day in a very small room with Dr. Parrott Scheinberg, whose specialty was dementia. And there were about 6 of us in the room. Dr. Scheinberg said to us, well, what would you do if one morning you awakened and found that your judgment was poor and you had terrible memory and you really just couldn't figure out what to do? And the student next to me raised his hand and said that he would transfer to law school. So the next slide that I'm going to show you, I think, is probably one of the most meaningful slides of the morning, and I'm going to do my very best to stay on time schedule. We spend a lot of time with our physical appearances wanting to look right, wanting to look attractive, but we spend precious little time devoted to what we can do to maintain brain health, and I really feel like this slide characterizes it.
Hello, I'd like to order french fries, a burger, and a milkshake.
This is a library.
I'd like to order french fries, a burger, and a milkshake.
All right, so thank you very much. Let's have lunch. The cardinal features of brain health and really brain degeneration, we've talked about them in other contexts throughout this conference, are inflammation and oxidative stress. This magazine cover you've seen earlier, again, inflammation, the cornerstone of so many of our diseases. In neurodegenerative diseases, inflammation is key. In virtually every neurodegenerative disease that you can think of that has a vowel in its name, inflammation is playing a key role. We're now able to actually visualize these activated microglial cells, the mediators of the brain on fire, which is really what inflammation is. We don't sense that inflammation because the brain lacks receptivity for sensation or interpretation. Retrospective studies have shown us that those individuals taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs have a dramatically decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease, for example. I'm not advocating that we load up on NSAIDs, but a significant risk reduction in those individuals taking NSAIDs for 2 years or more. In fact, interventional trials using indomethacin and other anti-inflammatories have shown modest actual improvement on mini mental status tests and other cognitive assessments in the Alzheimer's patients. So we recognize that inflammation is playing such an important role because we can measure post-mortem these pro-inflammatory cytokines in the Alzheimer's brain and compare them to the brains of non-afflicted individuals. We're able to visualize these reactive brain microglial cells and see that they're activated and turned on. We know that this very primitive pathway, the complement pathway, that's even been described in jellyfish, is activated in the Alzheimer's brain, and as mentioned, the effect of the anti-inflammatory drugs, I think, is pretty profound. Yesterday, we heard a discussion of the importance of tumor necrosis factor alpha. This is a very, very important inflammatory mediator cytokine in neurologic disease because of its effects on interleukin-1. We know why it's so important now. It's because it enhances the production of amyloid plaque, neurofibrillary tangles, and even Lewy bodies. There is so much focus on tumor necrosis factor alpha, and we're going to spend a little time in talking about the scientific approaches to modulating TNF-alpha and then look at the more natural approaches that we are now understanding. But it's not just because tumor necrosis factor alpha is an inflammatory mediator that leads to inflammation, that leads to this cascade increasing free radical damage to the neurons, that makes it so important. We now know that tumor necrosis factor alpha provides a static on the line of brain transmission, allowing the signal not to happen appropriately in these what are called neural networks, or these patterns of neuronal connections that allow sophisticated brain function. A lot of interesting reports have just come out, actually from California, where etanercept or Enbrel is being administered into the brains of individuals. It's administered by putting people in Trendelenburg position, Alzheimer's patients, and injecting etanercept, which is a tumor necrosis factor antagonist, into the perispinal venous plexus, and then by putting them in Trendelenburg, this gets into their brains, an inhibitor of TNF-alpha. And this has become really some very, very exciting news. Why? Because patients are now being described who suddenly wake up from their Alzheimer's disease. This was just reported. This is a man been asked to draw a clock, put the hands on the clock and the numbers, and 2 months later, this is a moderate to end-stage Alzheimer's patient, and look what he does with the clock. The numbers are in an appropriate position, and the test where you go from 1 to A, 2 to B, 3 to C, etc., is then done completely appropriately. Since this publication, neurologists around the country, I would suspect around the world, are being bombarded with desperate families saying, can you inject my husband or my wife's neck with etanercept? And obviously, no one's really able to jump that, make that leap yet because there's some safety issues. But my presentation simply of this information is to focus on this inflammatory cytokine and the key role of inflammatory issues in brain degeneration, not just in Alzheimer's, but in Parkinson's as well. Again, those individuals taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs have a remarkable risk reduction of Parkinson's disease. These individuals had a 48% risk reduction, those simply taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So that when we look at a Parkinson's patient with the classic symptoms, classic findings, the hunched back, the masked faces, the rigidity, the tremor, we should be thinking inflammation. We should be thinking the brain on fire. And here's an original description, a person crouching of the head and with the staring eyes, bending at the trunk, shoulders drooped with difficulty turning and rocking the low back, inability to flex at the back, etc. And of course, we ascribed the original description of this to Dr. James Parkinson, whose name has been attached to the disease, and actually this was described in the 4th century BC in the Yellow Emperor's Neijing. The original description. More than just describing an illness, which is what neurologists are really known for. I mean, once you name an illness, the patient leaves the office. This was an approach using things like peony root and licorice root, gastrodia, things that we now recognize had anticholinergic effects, antioxidant effects, which is now a focus in the treatment and even prevention of Parkinson's disease. Well, let's take a quick look at these inflammatory mediators, both interleukin-1 beta, and a real important focus for us today is tumor necrosis factor alpha. In comparing the Parkinson's brain with that of the controls, dramatically upregulated production of this inflammatory mediator. So what modulates the expression of TNF-alpha? And I'm going to get a little bit biochemical and scientific here, but I think as time goes by in my life, I'm realizing that many of the answers are not going to be found in biochemistry. We'll talk more about that later. But let's focus on this PPAR activity. These are the modulators of production of things like TNF-alpha. And interesting that these also regulate metabolism in response to lipid intake, stimulating adipose tissue differentiation, apropos the previous lecture this morning. And of course, the PPARs are dramatically involved in regulating serum glucose. You're all familiar with Actose and Avandia. These are PPAR gamma ligands. And they function by activating this cascade that then has an important role to play in regulation of blood sugar. But beyond that, they play such an important role in regulation of the production of these inflammatory mediators. In this study, report demonstrates that the actual production of amyloid is governed to some degree by the activity of these PPAR gamma ligands. This is the amyloid protein, and the real issue with this protein, we used to see amyloid in the brains of patients, and it was originally described as sort of being the detritus, the tombstones of fallen neuronal soldiers. But we now recognize that this protein is extremely metabolically active and really serves as the catalyst for this inflammatory issue that permeates the Alzheimer's brain. When the microglia become attached to the amyloid protein, this ultimately turns them on, they become activated, and this leads to the production of these inflammatory cytokines.